Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. And welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself with our series of interviews with Rob Johnson, who joins us again in the studio. Thanks for joining us again, Rob.
My pleasure.
So one more time, Rob is president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He's also a senior fellow and director of the Global Finance Project for the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute in New York. Previously, Robert was a managing director at Soros Fund Management, where he managed a global currency bond and equity portfolio. And he was, as I've said, one of the men who broke the Bank of England. Thanks again. So we're going to pick up Rob's narrative. He left working on Capitol Hill with the budget and such committees and went into the private sector. You worked at a private bank, and then you go and you work at, what year do you join Soros?
1992.
1992. As you leave working for government, and we talked about the period of the finance becoming so overwhelmingly powerful. You see the sausage of legislation, finance legislation being written, which makes you dubious about the whole process. And you can start, you must know, I mean, you can see the social consequences of these policies. This is this never was an equal society, but the roots of tremendous inequality are in that period of the 80s. This is where the equality gap starts to take off. How does that affect you personally? Just go back to your roots in Detroit, and to be frank with you, you don't make a choice. Your next choice isn't, oh, I'm going to become a reformist evangelical fighter to try to make this system more equal. You go into banking to make money.
Well, I went to work for a hedge fund as a financial speculator. I would say at the time, I wasn't thinking like I was a socially responsible visionary. I still viewed myself, even in 1992, as a young person getting an education, meaning I could be in a place where I had plane tickets all over the world, access to consultants, Reuters machines, eventually Bloomberg machines, and I could start, what you might say, to comprehend what was happening on the planet with all of these things at my disposal. When I went to work in Soros's firm, I thought the 12 or 13 partners there were amongst the most brilliant people I'd ever met. So there was a pure level of curiosity that motivated me. One of my colleagues, Stanley Druckenmiller, who I used to call the Michael Jordan of traders, and I think that was true in that time, he once said to me that the dirty little secret is that if we had been paid $50,000 rather than much more money, that we still would have done it because we loved what we were learning and what we were doing each day. And I don't think he was far off base there. And,
but the money increasingly got to be stratospheric.
Yes.
And now, that's got to be its own.
To be fair, though, in 1991, 1992, you're right, things are in motion. But the really hyperbolic increase in finance took place after the development of derivatives, which ironically happened under a Democrat. The Bill Clinton of Rubin and Summers Treasury is when this really took off. And then I would say the deregulation fostered by Alan Greenspan, who was a Republican, and the Democratic Treasury went wild under George W. Bush, where essentially the rules weren't even enforced. And you had the Enron scandal, no repair of all the off-balance sheet dimensions, in part thanks to Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, who worked very hard to maintain the capacity of all these off-balance sheet techniques, the special investment vehicles and other things, many of the things that were used in the crisis of 2008. But the financiers could see by the late 90s much more of this, what you might call unbridled free market sensibility than I could see in 1992.
You are an expert in 92 with exchange rates, currency speculation.
Yeah, when I'd worked with Bankers Trust Company, I worked on an intra-European fund and a very small fund I was building on intra-Asian currency and money market, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, places like that.
So for people who don't understand currency speculation, and I don't have any great expertise in currency speculation, but my understanding is you were either you're betting on your predictions of currency will either gain strength or lose strength, and you're going to bet one way or the other.
Yeah, you'll bet that the German Deutschmark is going to strengthen against the French franc or weaken against the French franc. It's betting on the relative strength of one against another country.
And is this actually then buying the currency, or you're playing hedge funds, you're buying positions?
You're buying Deutschmarks and financing it by borrowing French francs in the example I used.
So, within a certain amount of amounts, this is kind of normal within the way capitalist economics works. Big companies do this all the time. They try to stabilize their earnings.
Well, they have a commercial interest, which they might be called hedging, meaning they're insuring against being harmed by an adverse fluctuation in the currencies. Speculation is more of an outright decision to try to make money on the direction things are going.
Right. So, tell us the story then of what happened with the Bank of England.
Okay.
And both what happened and also sort of personally, where your own thinking through it.
Sure. When you see the advent of German unification, which is going to require tremendous scale infrastructure investment and development in Germany, you sense that Germany as a national economy is going to take off. It's going to have a very vibrant and robust period. The Germans also have a tradition which is to fight inflation. So the central bank isn't going to let that vitality lead to very, very rapid rises in inflation. They'll resist it by raising interest rates. Germany was embedded in what was called the exchange rate mechanism, the ERM of Europe, and within, say, 2.25% plus or minus, they were lashed to the French franc, the British pound, and Italian lira, and some other things. What you could sense is that Germany's, which you might call particulars associated with unification, were going to create a stress or a division, in this case between the British pound and the German Deutschmark, that there would be upward pressure on the Deutschmark, downward pressure on the pound. If the Brits wanted to stay in that system, they would have to raise their interest rates to give investors more incentive and therefore attract us to the pound. But higher interest rates in a society that had floating rate mortgages, widespread floating rate mortgages, was very credit and interest sensitive, would be very painful. So as this culminated, we saw a stress between Britain and Germany structurally reaching a point of potential rupture. And we also knew there were acrimonious relations between the Brits, their leaders, and the Germans. The Germans felt that the Deutschmark was the anchor currency of Europe. The British sterling had been the reserve currency of the world, and John Major, their prime minister, aspired to, which might say, the nostalgia of the British people, that the British pound should be in that role. We experienced a lot of acrimony or reports coming out of meetings between Norman Lamont, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the governor of the Bundesbank, and we drew inference from that very simply. If Britain gets under stress, Germany's not going to come to their assistance. And with that stress in mind, George Soros, who's a tremendously insightful psychologist, political economist, scenario builder, Stanley Druckenmiller, who I mentioned, was the Michael Jordan of traders, and myself, and another man named Scott Besant, who understood how balance sheets of British companies could be made very vulnerable by these interest rate rises. We had, in conversation, we developed the conviction that we should go
So
after
three of
this.
you were sitting around a table analyzing this together.
The three of us were at a table, and Scott, I believe, was in London, and those conversations led to the conviction that we could go after this, what looked like a one-sided bet. The British pound wasn't going to leap up and get strong, and it was bounded in a system. So we felt like we might lose 1% or so if we were wrong, and we might make 20%. So if you have a 20-to-1 shot, and
how much money have you got to play with here?
Well, we were authorized to do as much as, I believe, $15 billion by Mr. Soros, who set what you might call the magnitudes of leverage we could use through those conversations.
And you've said that you didn't just take advantage of a moment, you guys helped create the moment.
Well, to the extent that the British had roughly 22 billion of reserves, when we make a play of that magnitude, the probability that their reserves will be exhausted increases, and the rest of the market, as they see
to
those,
defend the pound, they have to use the reserves to buy pounds.
That's
and there's
right.
a certain
They have
point
to defend
they
the
run
pounds
out of
at the
money to
boundary.
buy pounds with.
And if they run out of money, then the boundary is a problem to defend, because they don't have the reserves or want to borrow to continue defending the boundary. And the market can infer that the pressure is strong and persistent over a number of days, so the probabilities change in favor of devaluation. But there were also divisions within the British Tory party at that time between those who were pro-Europe and those who were part of what you might call the transatlantic alliance, the special relationship with the United States, many of whom had not wanted to enter the ERM. So you could see the fault lines within the Tory party playing a role, meaning increasing the probability that when put under stress, they would abandon the system.
So you use $15 billion?
Didn't get quite there. The devaluation happened before we got to that.
You got to about 12, is that
Yeah,
what it
so
was?
10, 12, something like that.
But what do you do with the 12 exactly? What is it you do?
Well, you sit there and watch.
No. I mean, to put the pound under stress, you do what with the 12?
You are borrowing British pounds and converting them into Deutschmarks and investing them in Deutschmark short-term instruments. So you're going long the Deutschmark, short the pound repeatedly. And in this case, at the boundary, the British, as we're borrowing the pounds, they're having to provide them. As we're buying the Deutschmarks, they have to take the other side.
Yeah, so you force them into the other side.
We force them to liquidate their Deutschmark foreign exchange reserves and buy the pounds. And as they run out of reserves, the market observes it. It increases the likelihood of a devaluation.
So what happened? How big a devaluation?
Well, there were probably in the neighborhood of 15 to 20%, not all at one time. The lower boundary, I believe, was 277.5, and things got down as low as 220 over a number of weeks.
So the Soros fund makes what, about $1 billion on this play?
More than that, $1 billion in a day or two.
In a day or two.
And then eventually more than that.
And what do you know what the total amount was in there?
Call it, let's just say, I don't want to be too precise here, but $10 billion and 20%, that's about $2 billion.
Right. So what were the consequences of that devaluation?
Well, I think for the British economy, it allowed them to lower interest rates, restore competitiveness of their export sector. When it first happened, the British officials were embarrassed, and the press called it Black Wednesday. As the economy started to rebound from the slump, they called it White Wednesday because they considered it relief.
Black Wednesday is what, September 16th, 1992?
Right. And people started to refer to it as White Wednesday, the day they were unshackled from this ERM system and their economy could regain prosperity. With regard to what you might call the political economy of the experience, I think it was quite daunting that a very small boutique firm in New York could take on a G5 government and appear to win. It was a bellwether moment in understanding the growing power of private capital markets in relation to government policy.
What were the consequences of the devaluation on ordinary people's incomes? And the cost of living?
I would guess that, there are probably several. First of all, if you had a floating rate mortgage, the interest rates came way down, then you probably gained some purchasing power to the extent that you were buying, say, imported foodstuffs or imported, consumer durable equipment. There was probably approximately a 20% increase in the price as a result of a weaker pound relative to, say, imported goods from Siemens or someplace in Germany. I think economic activity started to rebound as the German economy was valued higher and the British regained competitiveness, so their export sector started and import competing sector started to thrive. It may have increased some employment. So there's mixed impact. There's some that are adverse and some that are beneficial depending on where you are within the economy.
you're still in this mode of learning. The amount of money that's getting made must be, I don't know what the word is. I've never experienced it.
It was surprising. It was, I would say, unprecedented in my family tree.
Yeah. I mean, people have described it as a kind of aphrodisiac. Do you get into this mood? I mean, it must be surreal to, one, to make that play and win, two, the amount of money.
You know, my father is a physician, and I remember talking with him, and it was a bit unsettling to him. And I said to him that I think that it was important for us both to discuss this, recognizing the correspondence between the money I'd made and the social value I had created was not something I believed in. I didn't see those things as I was making, you know, for our investors and so forth. They had benefited from our collective skill of this team, but I didn't personally think I had done anything. You know, the joke I used to tell my dad is, if I'm fortunate enough to see St. Peter and get through the gate, I'm not going to get in because I helped knock off the British pound. You know, that created a lot of personal freedom for me to do things in my life, whether it's philanthropically or with my own time and energy, that I hope to, how do you say, convince St. Peter at that time. But
how much? But it is on your mind at the time. This contradiction between.
Well, it's a big change in my life. I didn't.
No, but I mean this issue of, you know, this idea of making so much money without having produced anything, and what the social consequences of this are, and
the personal consequences.
That's what I'm getting at.
Knowing there was one of my partners at Soros said to me, "You now have antlers." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're a trophy animal. Whether it's real estate developers or tax collectors or whatever, people are going to zoom in on you now. And you have to," he basically said, "you have to grow up."
Some people have, in their critique of George Soros, but I guess it would apply to you too, that when you're talking now about financial reform and having a system that's not so irrational and not so predatory and not so, destructive, that you guys took advantage of exactly that.
Mm-hmm. What I would say in that respect, and I believe that George has lived by this, is that he's often said he was like a theater critic, and he looks for the fault lines. And as a financial investor, he takes advantage of them. But when he thinks they're harmful to society, he also makes public statement to awaken the officials to those fault lines and how they could be repaired. So he does not refrain from exploiting the fault lines, because he says others will get there if I don't. But he does invest in dialogue about the repair. He's not lobbying to perpetuate the malfunctions.
Okay, we're going to pick up the story in the next segment of our interview. So please join us for our series of interviews with Rob Johnson on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network.